Welcome to the Sleepless Readings Halloween Special. To celebrate on this All Hallows Eve, we'll be reading 3 classic tales of horror from years gone by. So settle in, turn down the lights, and join me for our first tale. Let's kick it off with a story first published in 1843. Here is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe.
True, nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing, acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to tell how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him, and every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it oh so gently. And then when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights. Every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea. And perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing on it steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or grief, oh no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it had welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "Is it nothing but the wind in the chimney? Is it only a mouse crossing the floor? Or is it merely a cricket which has made a single chirp?" Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a very long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at last a single dim ray like the thread of the spider shot out from the crevice and full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all of a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled to the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon his eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I told you that I'm nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heartbeat went on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatsoever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. Ha ha! When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves, with perfect suavity, as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until, at length, I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt now I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, louder, louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart.
I do enjoy that story. A window into one's madness is always haunting. I hope you're still sitting comfortably as we begin our next tale. This one written in 1894 by the incomparable H.G. Wells. Let's dive right into The Red Room. I can assure you, said I, that it will take a very tangible ghost to frighten me, and I stood up before the fire with my glass in hand. It is your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm, and glanced at me askance. 28 years, said I have lived, and never a ghost have I seen as yet. The old woman sat staring hard into the fire, her pale eyes wide open.
Aye?
She broke in.
And 28 years you've lived and never seen the likes of this house, I reckon. There's a many things to see when one's still but 28.
She swayed her head slowly from side to side.
A many things to see and sorrow for.
I half suspected the old people were trying to enhance the spiritual terrors of their house by their droning insistence. I put down my empty glass on the table and looked about the room, and caught a glimpse of myself, abbreviated and broadened to an impossible sturdiness, in the queer old mirror at the end of the room. "Well," I said, "if I see anything tonight, I shall be so much the wiser, for I come to the business with an open mind."
"It's your own choosing,"
said the man with the withered arm once more. I heard the sound of a stick and a shambling step on the flags in the passage outside, and the door creaked on its hinges as a second old man entered, more bent, more wrinkled, more aged even than the first. He supported himself by a single crutch. His eyes were covered by a shade, and his lower lip, half averted, hung pale and pink from his decaying yellow teeth. He made for an armchair on the opposite side of the table, sat down clumsily, and began to cough. The man with the withered arm gave this newcomer a short glance of positive dislike. The old woman took no notice of his arrival, but remained with her eyes fixed steadily on the fire.
"I said it's your own choosing,"
said the man with the withered arm, when the coughing had ceased for a while. "It's my own choosing," I answered. The man with the shade became aware of my presence for the first time, and threw his head back for a moment and sideways to see me. I caught a momentary glimpse of his eyes, small and bright and inflamed. Then he began to cough and splutter again.
"Why don't you drink?"
said the man with the withered arm, pushing the beer towards him. The man with the shade poured out a glassful, with a shaky hand that splashed half as much again on the deal table. A monstrous shadow of him crouched upon the wall and mocked his action as he poured and drank. I must confess I had scarce expected these grotesque custodians. There is, to my mind, something inhuman in senility, something crouching and atavistic. The human qualities seem to drop from old people insensibly day by day. The three of them made me feel uncomfortable with their gaunt silences, their bent carriage, their evident unfriendliness to me and one another. "If," said I, "you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will make myself comfortable there." The old man with the cough jerked his head back so suddenly that it startled me, and shot another glance of his red eyes at me from under the shade. But no one answered me. I waited a minute, glancing from one to the other. "If," I said a little louder, "if you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I'll relieve you from the task of entertaining me."
"There's a candle on the slab outside the door,"
said the man with the withered arm, looking at my feet as he addressed me.
"But if you go to the Red Room tonight,"
This night of all nights,
said the old woman.
"you go alone."
"Very well," I answered. "And which way do I go?"
"You go along the passage for a bit,"
said he.
"until you come to a door, and through that is a spiral staircase, and halfway up that is a landing, and another door covered with baize. Go through that and down the long corridor to the end, and the Red Room is on your left up the stairs."
"Have I got that right?" I said, and repeated his directions. He corrected me in one in particular.
"And you really are going?"
said the man with the shade, looking at me again for the third time with that queer, unnatural tilting of the face.
this night of all nights.
Said the old woman. "It is what I came for," I said, and moved towards the door. As I did so, the old man with the shade rose and staggered round the table so as to be closer to the others and to the fire. At the door I turned and looked at them, and saw they were all close together, dark against the firelight, staring at me over their shoulders with an intent expression on their ancient faces. "Good night," I said, setting the door open.
"It's your own choosing,"
said the man with the withered arm. I left the door wide open until the candle was well alight, and then I shut them in and walked down the chilly, echoing passage. I must confess that the oddness of these three old pensioners in whose charge her ladyship had left the castle, and the deep-toned, old-fashioned furniture of the housekeeper's room in which they foregathered, affected me in spite of my efforts to keep myself at a matter-of-fact phase. They seemed to belong to another age, an older age, an age when things spiritual were different from this of ours, less certain, an age when omens and witches were credible, and ghosts beyond denying. Their very existence was spectral, the cut of their clothing, fashions born in dead brains. The ornaments and conveniences of the room about them were ghostly, the thoughts of vanished men, which still haunted rather than participated in the world of today. But with an effort, I sent such thoughts to the right about. The long, drafty subterranean passage was chilly and dusty,
and my candle flared and made the shadows cower and quiver. The echoes rang up and down the spiral staircase, and a shadow came sweeping up after me, and one fled before me into the darkness overhead. I came to the landing and stopped there for a moment, listening to a rustling that I fancied I'd heard. Then, satisfied of the absolute silence, I pushed open the baize-covered door and stood in the corridor. The effect was scarcely what I expected, for the moonlight, coming in by the great window on the grand staircase, picked out everything in vivid black shadow or silvery illumination. Everything was in its place. The house might have been deserted only yesterday instead of 18 months ago. There were candles in the sockets of the sconces, and whatever dust had gathered on the carpets, or upon the polished flooring, was distributed so evenly as to be invisible in the moonlight. I was about to advance and stopped abruptly. A bronze group stood upon the landing, hidden from me by the corner of the wall, but its shadow fell with marvelous distinction upon the white paneling and gave me the impression of someone crouching to waylay me. I stood rigid for half a minute perhaps. Then, with my hand in my pocket that held my revolver, I advanced, only to discover a Ganymede and eagle glistening in the moonlight. That incident for a time restored my nerve, and a porcelain Chinaman on a buhl table, whose head rocked silently as I passed him, scarcely startled me. The door to the Red Room and steps up to it were in a shadowy corner. I moved my candle from side to side in order to see clearly the nature of the recess in which I stood before opening the door. Here it was, thought I, that my predecessor was found, and the memory of that story gave me a sudden twinge of apprehension. I glanced over my shoulder at the Ganymede in the moonlight and opened the door of the Red Room rather hastily, with my face half turned to the pallid silence of the landing. I entered, closed the door behind me at once, turning the key I found in the lock within, and stood with the candle held aloft, surveying the scene of my vigil, the great Red Room of Lorraine Castle, in which the young Duke had died, or rather, in which he had begun his dying, for he had opened the door and fallen headlong down the steps I had just ascended. That had been the end of his vigil, of his gallant attempt to conquer the ghostly tradition of the place. And never, thought I, had apoplexy better served the ends of superstition. And there were other and older stories that clung to the room, back to the half-credible beginning of it all, the tale of a timid wife and the tragic end that came to her husband's jest of frightening her. And looking around that large, somber room, with its shadowy window bays, its recesses and alcoves, one could well understand the legends that had sprouted in its black corners, its germinating darkness. My candle was a little tongue of light in its vastness that failed to pierce the opposite end of the room and left an ocean of mystery and suggestion beyond its island of light. I resolved to make a systematic examination of the place at once and dispel the fanciful suggestions of its obscurity before they obtained a hold upon me. After satisfying myself of the fastening of the door, I began to walk about the room, peering round each article of furniture, tucking up the valances of the bed and opening its curtains wide. I pulled up the blinds and examined the fastenings of the several windows before closing the shutters, leant forward and looked up the blackness of the wide chimney and tapped the dark oak paneling for any secret opening. There were 2 big mirrors in the room, each with a pair of sconces bearing candles, and on the mantel shelf too were more candles in china candlesticks. All these I lit one after the other. The fire was laid, an unexpected consideration from the old housekeeper, and I lit it to keep down any disposition to shiver, and when it was burning well, I stood round with my back to it and regarded the room again. I had pulled up a chintz-covered armchair and a table to form a kind of barricade before me, and on this lay my revolver ready to hand. My precise examination had done me good, but I still found the remoter darkness of the place and its perfect stillness too stimulating for the imagination. The echoing of the stir and crackling of the fire was no sort of comfort to me. The shadow in the alcove at the end in particular had that undefiable quality of a presence, that odd suggestion of a lurking, living thing that comes so easily in silence and solitude. At last, to reassure myself, I walked with a candle into it, and satisfied myself that there was nothing tangible there. I stood that candle upon the floor of the alcove and left it in that position. By this time I was in a state of considerable nervous tension, although to my reason there was no adequate cause for the condition. My mind, however, was perfectly clear. I postulated quite unreservedly that nothing supernatural could happen,
and to pass the time I began to string some rhymes together, Inglesby fashion of the original legend of the place. A few I spoke aloud, but the echoes were not pleasant. For the same reason I also abandoned, after a time, a conversation with myself upon the impossibility of ghosts and haunting. My mind reverted to the 3 old and distorted people downstairs, and I tried to keep it upon that topic. The somber reds and blacks of the room troubled me. Even with 7 candles, the place was merely dim. The one in the alcove flared in a draught, and the fire flickering kept the shadows and penumbra perpetually shifting and stirring. Casting about for a remedy, I recalled the candles I had seen in the passage, and, with a slight effort, walked out into the moonlight, carrying a candle and leaving the door open, and presently returned with as many of them as 10. These I put in various knickknacks of china with which the room was sparsely adorned, lit, and placed where the shadows had lain deepest, some on the floor, some in the window recesses, until at last my 17 candles were so arranged that not an inch of the room but had the direct light of at least one of them. It occurred to me that when the ghost came, I could warn him not to trip over them. The room was now quite brightly illuminated. There was something very cheery and reassuring in those little streaming flames, and snuffing them gave me an occupation, and afforded a helpful sense of the passage of time. Even with that, however, the brooding expectation of the vigil weighed heavily upon me. It was after midnight that the candle in the alcove suddenly went out, and the black shadow sprang back to its place there. I did not see the candle go out. I simply turned and saw that the darkness was there, as one might start and see the unexpected presence of a stranger.
"By Jove," said I aloud, "that draft's a strong one."
And, taking the matches from the table, I walked across the room in a leisurely manner to relight the corner again. My first match would not strike, and as I succeeded with the second, something seemed to blink on the wall before me. I turned my head involuntarily and saw that the 2 candles on the little table by the fireplace were extinguished.
I rose at once to my feet.
"Odd," I said. "Did I do that myself in a flash of absent-mindedness?"
I walked back, relit one, and as I did so, I saw the candle in the right sconce of one of the mirrors wink and go right out, and almost immediately its companion followed it. There was no mistake about it. The flame vanished, as if the wicks had suddenly been nipped between a finger and thumb, leaving the wick neither glowing nor smoking, but black. While I stood gaping, the candle at the foot of the bed went out, and the shadows seemed to take another step towards me.
"This won't do,"
said I, and first one and then another candle on the mantelshelf followed.
"What's up?"
I cried, with a queer high note getting into my voice somehow. At that, the candle on the wardrobe went out, and the one I had relit in the alcove followed.
"Steady on," I said. "These candles are wanted,"
speaking with a half-hysterical facetiousness, and scratching away at a match the while for the mantel candlesticks. My hands trembled so much that twice I missed the rough paper of the matchbox. As the mantel emerged from the darkness again, 2 candles in the remoter end of the window were eclipsed. But with the same match, I also relit the larger mirror candles, and those on the floor near the doorway, so that for the moment I seemed to gain on the extinctions. But then in a volley there vanished 4 lights at once in different corners of the room, and I struck another match in a quivering haste, and stood hesitating whether to take it. As I stood undecided, an invisible hand seemed to sweep out the 2 candles on the table. With a cry of terror, I dashed at the alcove, then into the corner, and then into the window, relighting 3 as 2 more vanished by the fireplace. Then, perceiving a better way, I dropped the matches on the iron-bound deed box in the corner, and caught up the bedroom candlestick. With this, I avoided the delay of striking matches, but for all that, the steady process of extinction went on, and the shadows I feared and fought against returned and crept in upon me. First a step gained on this side of me, and then on that. It was like a ragged storm cloud sweeping out the stars. Now and then one returned for a minute and was lost again. I was now almost frantic with the horror of the coming darkness, and my self-possession deserted me. I leaped, panting and disheveled, from candle to candle, in a vain struggle against that remorseless advance. I bruised myself on the thigh against the table. I sent a chair headlong. I stumbled and fell and whisked the cloth from the table in my fall. My candle rolled away from me, and I snatched another as I rose. Abruptly, this was blown out, as I swung it off the table, by the wind of my sudden movement, and immediately the 2 remaining candles followed. But there was still light in the room. a red light that staved off the shadows from me. The fire! Of course. I could still thrust my candle between the bars and relight it. I turned to where the flames were still dancing between the glowing coals and splashing red reflections upon the furniture, made 2 steps towards the grate, and incontinently the flames dwindled and vanished. The glow vanished. The reflections rushed together and vanished. And as I thrust the candle between the bars, darkness closed upon me like the shutting of an eye, wrapped about me in a stifling embrace, sealed my vision, and crushed my last vestiges of reason from my brain. The candle fell from my hand. I flung out my arms in a vain effort to thrust that ponderous blackness away from me, and, lifting up my voice, screamed with all my might, once, twice, thrice. Then I think I must have staggered to my feet. I know I thought suddenly of the moonlit corridor, and, with my head bowed and my arms over my face, made a run for the door. But I had forgotten the exact position of the door, and struck myself heavily against the corner of the bed. I staggered back, turned, and was either struck or struck myself against some other bulky furniture. I have a vague memory of battering myself thus, to and fro in the darkness, of a cramped struggle, and of my own wild crying as I darted to and fro, of a heavy blow at last on my forehead, a horrible sensation of falling that lasted an age, of my last frantic effort to keep my footing, and then I remember no more. I opened my eyes in daylight. My head was roughly bandaged, and the man with the withered arm was watching my face. I looked about me, trying to remember what had happened, and for a space I could not recollect. I rolled my eyes into the corner and saw the old woman, no longer abstracted, pouring out some drops of medicine from a little blue phial into a glass.
Where am I? I asked. I seem to remember you, and yet I cannot remember who you are.
They told me then, and I heard of the haunted Red Room as one who hears a tale.
"We found you at dawn,"
said he,
"and there was blood on your forehead and lips."
It was very slowly I recovered my memory of my experience.
"You believe now,"
said the old man,
"that the room is haunted?"
He spoke no longer as one who greets an intruder, but as one who grieves for a broken friend.
"Yes,"
said I,
"the room is haunted."
"And you have seen it, and we, who have lived here all our lives, have never set eyes upon it, because we have never dared. Tell us, is it truly the old Earl who—"
"No,"
said I,
"it is not."
I told you so,
said the old lady with the glass in her hand.
It is his poor young countess who was frightened.
"It is not,"
I said.
"There is neither ghost of Earl nor ghost of Countess in that room. There is no ghost there at all, but worse, far worse."
Well,
they said.
"The worst of all the things that haunt poor mortal man,"
said I.
"and that is, in all its nakedness, fear that will not have light nor sound, that will not bear with reason, that deafens and darkens and overwhelms. It followed me through the corridor. It fought against me in the room."
I stopped abruptly. There was an interval of silence. My hand went up to my bandages. Then the man with the shade sighed and spoke.
"That is it,"
said he.
"I knew that was it. A power of darkness. To put such a curse upon a woman. It lurks there always. You can feel it even in the daytime, even of a bright summer's day, in the hangings, in the curtains, keeping behind you however you face about. In the dusk it creeps along the corridor and follows you, so that you dare not turn. There is fear in that room of hers. Black fear, and there will be, so long as this house of sin endures."
"I'm not sure I'd fancy staying in that house, though I suppose you'd never feel lonely if you did. Let's continue with our final tale of the evening. First published in 1902, let's finish with the classic tale entitled The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire.
"Hark at the wind,"
said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it.
I'm listening.
Said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand.
Check.
"I should hardly think that he'd come tonight,"
said his father with his hand poised over the board.
Mate,
replied the son.
"That's the worst of living so far out,"
bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence.
"Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways are bog and the roads are torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter."
Never mind, dear,
said his wife soothingly.
Perhaps you'll win the next one.
Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard.
There he is,
said Herbert White as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said,
"Tut tut,"
and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage.
"Sergeant Major Morris,"
he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey in tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples.
21 years of it,
said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son.
When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him.
He don't look to have taken much harm,
said Mrs. White politely.
I'd like to go to India myself,
said the old man.
Just to look around a bit, you know.
Better where you are,
said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again.
I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers,
said the old man.
What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?
Nothing,
said the soldier hastily.
Leastways, nothing worth hearing.
Monkey's paw?
Said Mrs. White, curiously.
Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps,
said the sergeant major, offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him.
To look at,
said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket.
It's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy.
He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously.
And what is there special about it?
Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table.
It had a spell put on it by an old fakir,
said the sergeant major.
A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it.
His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat.
Well, why don't you have 3, sir?
Said Herbert White, cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth.
I have,
he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened.
And you really did have the 3 wishes granted?
Asked Mrs. White.
I did,
said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth.
And has anybody else wished?
Persisted the old lady.
The first man had his 3 wishes, yes,
was the reply.
I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw.
His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group.
If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris,
said the old man at last.
What do you keep it for?
The soldier shook his head.
Fancy, I suppose,
he said slowly.
I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It's caused enough mischief already.
Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward.
If you could have another 3 wishes,
said the old man, eyeing him keenly.
Would you have them?
I don't know,
said the other.
I don't know.
He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off.
Better let it burn,
said the soldier solemnly.
If you don't want it, Morris,
said the other.
Give it to me.
I won't,
said his friend doggedly.
I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man.
The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely.
How do you do it?
He inquired.
Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud,
said the sergeant major.
But I warn you of the consequences.
Sounds like the Arabian Nights,
said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper.
Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?
Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm.
If you must wish,
he said gruffly,
wish for something sensible.
Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India.
If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us,
said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train,
we shan't make much out of it.
Did you give him anything for it, Father?
inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely.
A trifle,
said he, colouring slightly.
He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away.
Likely,
said Herbert with pretended horror.
Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to begin with, then you can't be henpecked.
He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously.
I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact,
he said slowly.
It seems to me I've got all I want.
If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?
Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder.
Well, wish for £200 then, that'll just do it.
His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords.
I wish for £200,
said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him.
It moved,
he cried with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor.
As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake.
Well, I don't see the money,
said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table.
And I bet I never shall.
It must have been your fancy, Father,
said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head.
Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same.
They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night.
I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed,
said Herbert as he bade them good night.
And something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains.
He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues.
I suppose all old soldiers are the same,
said Mrs. White.
The idea of all listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?
Might drop on his head from the sky,
said the frivolous Herbert.
Morris said the things happened so naturally,
said his father,
that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence.
Well, don't break into the money before I come back,
said Herbert as he rose from the table.
I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you.
His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits, when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill.
Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home,
she said as they sat at dinner.
I dare say,
said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer.
But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to.
You thought it did,
said the old lady soothingly.
I say it did,
replied the other.
There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter?
His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited, as patiently as her sex would permit, for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent.
I was asked to call,
he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers.
I come from Moore and Meggins.
The old lady started.
Is anything the matter?
She asked breathlessly.
Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?
Her husband interposed.
There, mother,
he said hastily.
Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir.
And he eyed the other wistfully.
I'm sorry,
began the visitor.
Is he hurt?
Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent.
Badly hurt,
he said quietly.
But he is not in any pain.
Oh, thank God,
said the old woman, clasping her hands.
Thank God for that, She
broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence.
He was caught in the machinery,
said the visitor at length in a low voice.
Caught in the machinery,
repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion.
Yes.
He sat staring blankly out at the window, and, taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before.
He was the only one left to us,
he said, turning gently to the visitor.
It is hard.
The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window.
The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss,
he said without looking round.
I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders.
There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action.
I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility,
continued the other.
They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation.
Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and raising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words.
How much?
£200,
was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead,
and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened.
Come back,
He said tenderly.
you will be cold.
It is colder for my son.
Said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start.
The paw!
She cried wildly.
The monkey's paw!
He started up in alarm.
Where is it? What's the matter?
She came stumbling across the room toward him.
I want it.
She said quietly.
You've not destroyed it.
It's in the parlor on the bracket.
He replied, marveling.
Why?
She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek.
I only just thought of it.
She said hysterically.
Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?
Think of what?
He questioned.
The other 2 wishes.
She replied rapidly.
We've only had one.
Was that not enough?
He demanded fiercely.
No.
She cried triumphantly.
We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again.
The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs.
Good God, you are mad!
He cried, aghast.
Get it.
She panted.
Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy. My boy.
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle.
Get back to bed,
He said, unsteadily.
You don't know what you're saying.
We had the first wish granted.
Said the old woman feverishly.
Why not the second?
A coincidence.
Stammered the old man.
Go and get it and wish.
Cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook.
He has been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
Bring him back.
Cried the old woman and dragged him toward the door.
Do you think I fear the child I've nursed?
He went down into the darkness and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
Wish!
She cried in a strong voice.
It is foolish and wicked.
He faltered.
Wish!
Repeated his wife. He raised his hand.
I wish my son alive again.
The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward, the old woman came silently and apathetically behind him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another. And at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
Cried the old woman, starting up.
A rat,
said the old man in shaking tones.
A rat. It passed me on the stairs.
His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house.
It's Herbert!
She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly.
What are you going to do?
He whispered hoarsely.
It's my boy! It's Herbert!
She cried, struggling mechanically.
I forgot it was 2 miles away! What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door!
For God's sake, don't let it in!
Cried the old man, trembling.
You're afraid of your own son!
She cried, struggling.
Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert! I'm coming!
There was another knock, and another. The old woman with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting.
The bolt!
She cried loudly.
Come down, I can't reach it!
But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in the search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
Truly a timeless tale that proves you should always be careful what you wish for. Sadly, that brings us to the end of this year's Halloween special. I hope you've enjoyed these classic tales of horror and have had a sufficiently spooky time. Happy Halloween.
Don't forget to like the video, it does help to boost the channel.
There's new stories every Sunday.
So subscribe.
And ring the bell.
Thanks, guys. And, as always, stay sleepless.